The grandmother of Bethany Decker, Miss Evelyn Bales, contacts the sheriff's office, and she said that Bethany was a young student at George Mason University. It had been 3 weeks since Bethany had had contact with anyone.
We learned she was last seen by her family on the late evening hours of January 28th when she was at her grandmother's house in Maryland. Her family told us she was married to Emil Decker.
They had a child together, but Emil had also had a commitment to the United States military.
I just want to give a lovely shout out to my wife and to my son, Kai. I love you and I miss you very much. Have a Merry Christmas.
Her family told us Emil was with Bethany at her grandmother's house the night before she disappeared. However, he was redeployed overseas days later.
Our family was really close to Bethany throughout her entire life. Bethany had a child. Her mother was watching Kai at that time, helping Bethany out with school. And we were concerned. When Bethany did not visit, I called Bethany every single day for an entire week, and she didn't answer the phone. We really were fearing for Bethany.
Our deputy made contact with the apartment manager, asked if she would open the door, and entered the apartment. It seemed like Bethany had moved out of that apartment, but he notices a pile of women's clothes and a purse and a set of keys that the family's able to identify as being Bethany's.
A woman in a pocketbook is almost inseparable, so that to me throws a little red flag up.
Outside, our deputy discovered that Bethany's car is in the parking lot. There's a flat tire, there's dust all over the vehicle. Not every missing persons case is going to immediately be assigned to a detective, but there was enough red flags for us to think that it immediately needed to be looked into.
Bethany is my oldest daughter. She was one who could get anybody to smile no matter what mood you were in. She just loved to have fun and had a laugh that was just infectious.
We used to have this old car and the radio was broken. And to fill that silence, she would basically scream at the top of her lungs. So she'd sing a song and then she'd turn the knob and switch the station right in the middle. And she would just keep doing it. And I thought that was the most funny thing in the world. I loved hearing her, even when she was singing just to be funny.
She had a love for life, and so when she found out she was having a little boy, she was excited. She had all of these amazing dreams for him.
She would let us put our hand on her belly and feel him kick, and always shared like her progress reports going to the doctors. She loved Kai from the moment she laid eyes on him.
From a law enforcement standpoint, what stood out was the nature and the complexity of the relationships that she had.
Her family told us Bethany was involved in a relationship with a man who was not her husband, Ronald Roldan.
She met him at work while Emil was deployed. He was a friend at work who also had 2 young children. Seemed like he was struggling.
And he had no place to live. So Bethany felt bad for him and said he could come and stay until he found a place. But Ronald never left.
And by January, Bethany was pregnant with Ronald's baby. But Emil, along the way, was still trying to work on their relationship, trying to win her back. We thought, is it possible that Emil or Ronald became enraged and had hurt her? Or is it possible that she just got overwhelmed and decided to flee? So getting both Emil Decker and Ronald Roldan to come in to cooperate was the next big step in the case.
So the last time you saw her, or even heard from her?
So the last time I actually saw her was probably like on Saturday.
The 29th?
29th.
Yeah. Of January.
January this year.
Yeah.
He recounts that Bethany comes home from her grandmother's house. Later that day, he thought Bethany was leaving to hang out with friends that she hadn't seen in a while.
But she didn't come home.
You have tried to call her?
Of course I tried to call her and it went straight to voicemail.
So what do you think happened?
I don't know. No matter what, like, we were gonna move toward the end of January. And when she stopped contacting me, like, the only thing I could think of, I was like, she with her family, either with her grandma or her mom.
Ronald Roldan said he did not have contact with Bethany Decker's family because the family tried on a few occasions to break up the relationship.
I've never met her mom.
Mm-hmm.
This lady doesn't like me because I'm dating her daughter that's married.
So where do you think she is? I mean,
I don't know. The only thing is, like, yeah, I know she would never hurt herself, but I know she's just going through a lot, you know. But
Following that initial interview, it gives us a little bit of hope that if we just try a little harder, do a few more interviews, maybe we can still locate her safe and sound. Over the next couple of days, we got search warrants for her cell phone records and for her financial records. The most disheartening part is that not only did Bethany's cell phone records stop on the 29th of January, but we had no more financial transactions for her either. At that point, we have to start looking at this as something possibly more nefarious than just a young lady who got overwhelmed and decided to flee. We knew that Emil was being cheated on by his wife, and she was pregnant with Ronald's baby. He has every motive to harm her. We had to get as many questions answered as we can before he decides to get up and leave that room.
Emil was with Bethany the night before she disappeared at her grandmother's house in Maryland.
He said they knew she was in an abusive relationship with Roldan and that she was in fear of leaving him.
So they were trying to convince Bethany that she just needs to leave Ronald. And Emil said he would raise this child that Bethany and Ronald were having as his own, all in the name of trying to reconcile and save their marriage. But she keeps telling him she's got to get back to Ronald because if she doesn't, things will be bad.
Ultimately, Bethany decided to leave and go back to her apartment.
So now we have Ronald Roldan, who through his own statements is the last person to see her alive, and we believe that he was emotionally and physically abusive. It's just starting to lend credence to the idea that Ronald Roldan is involved in some way, shape, or form in the disappearance of Bethany Decker.
All right, see. Okay, Ronald, have a seat right there if you would.
The goal is to gain more information, see what we can get out of him, catch him in some lies, question him, but again, still fairly softly because you don't want to lose him.
We understand and we appreciate you come up here voluntarily with us today.
Sure.
And you're free to go without any problems whatsoever.
Okay.
You know, we're still good friends, right?
Yeah.
All right.
If he says, I want to speak with my lawyer, we may never get another shot at him, and then this goes into the cold case unit, and we may never find out what happened to Bethany.
This morning, police in Virginia are tracking down leads in the case of a missing pregnant mother. 21-year-old Bethany Ann Decker was last seen January 29th, but wasn't reported missing till February 19th. Decker's 17-month-old son, Kai, is living with her grandparents while she finishes her college degree in Virginia. Her husband is serving in Afghanistan. People who know Bethany say she would never leave Kai behind.
There was always the fear and that devastation that she was gone, but I was in limbo. You know, this spot right between heaven and hell. There was nothing but questions. You know, what happened? Where is she? Why? All we could do is hope.
Now, the last day you saw her was that Saturday, right? Yeah. Okay, the 29th. And I think we determined the 29th because remember the 28th she went to see her grandmother. Mm-hmm. Did she talk, when she came home on the 29th, did she talk about how that went with the grandma?
Her and her grandma got in an argument. And she was like, she's such a bitch, and stuff like that. I was like, whenever she would say stuff like that, like I wouldn't, like I don't know them, so I'm not gonna be like, yeah, she is. So, but I was like, I'm sorry, you want something to eat, try to just get her mind off of it.
Ronald Roldan appears like he's a classic charmer. He gravitates towards Detective Poland, so you see an on-the-fly interview change where Detective Hallie is allowing Detective Poland to ask more questions because she seems to have that connection with Ronald.
Did she take her car when she left? Because she only has the one car, right? Mm-hmm. Then you don't hear from her at all? Nothing? Mm-hmm. When do you notice the car back in front of the apartment? Her car?
That was on, let's see, okay, so that's Saturday.
On?
Monday night.
And that's when you noticed?
Yeah, when I went outside.
Okay.
And I was like, huh? I was like, look. I was like, her car's here.
Now he's shielding his face, he's got that slouched body position, signs that an investigator picks up that maybe this guy's not telling the truth.
Did you ever think about calling law enforcement and saying, hey, my girlfriend is missing?
Did you text her and say, hey, what's going on?
I didn't know she was missing.
You've been really, really good about helping us. I think at this point, it would help us out a lot if you would agree to take a polygraph. Would you be willing to help us do that?
I mean, I have no problem. I have no problem helping you guys out, but I mean,
if you have nothing to hide, the machine, the person, the operator, will come forward and tell us that.
Okay, so I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, are you guys putting me like under arrest right now?
No.
So,
well, I just thought you wanted to help us because you've been helpful so far.
I definitely do. I definitely do. You guys could look through any of my stuff. You guys could look through, I've let you look at emails and messages and everything.
Can I borrow this for a couple minutes to copy the messages? Because that really helps us on the timeline when you guys are talking.
That's not a problem.
Okay, I will be back. Do you want me to bring, I have Girl Scout cookies. Anyone hungry?
So now he's rejected a polygraph. When his response is almost adversarial, you have to decide, how are you going to react to that? How are you going to make them your friend again?
I have been. I've been trying to tell
her now.
Okay.
So I don't know.
I don't have to put myself in your shoes. This was supposed to take like an hour. I feel like I've been here forever.
You don't want to help us.
I really want to go home. I don't feel good.
Are you thinking about yourself right now, or are you thinking about Bethany?
Of course I'm thinking. You guys don't care about me. You guys do not care about me.
Now he's worried. He gets much more focused on himself and the jam that he thinks he might be in. So she's really working hard to try to keep him engaged.
Were you abusive to her?
Never.
Physically abusive?
Never.
Okay. Do you know that she did tell people that you were physically abusive to her?
No, I did not know that.
Okay. Well, apparently she did, because that's what we're being told.
Wow. Never. I've never been physically abusive to her.
Never laid a hand on her?
Never.
Have you taken a polygraph before?
I've never taken a polygraph in my life.
You understand why we're asking you, because you're her boyfriend and the last one to see her.
I totally understand. So.
Well, Dan has had very weak answers. He can't even look at her when he's answering her. I mean, Detective Poland's throwing punches, so she wants to punch him where maybe his guard will go down. Or you may get him to slip up.
Do you think we're trying to do something here? I mean, no, honestly, be honest with me. I've been honest with you. That's all I asked for. Be honest with me.
I've been honest with you, and I think I'll tell you the truth. You guys care about yourselves and your job. I totally understandable, but I have to care about myself.
Are you afraid that the truth's going to make you look bad?
But first of all, I shouldn't have even come here and talked to you guys.
But I'm trying to find out what happened to Bethany. Okay? And I think Bethany's loved ones deserve to know what happened to her. Do you agree with me?
Right.
We were definitely getting into that territory where Ronald could shut down and walk out. At that point, you've got to pull the Band-Aid off, and you've got to ask the hard questions. We need to find Bethany Decker.
Do you want to know what happened to her?
Yes.
You do want to know?
Yes.
Do you know what happened to her?
No.
But you want to know?
Yes.
But you don't want to stay here and help me find out?
No. I just.
Do you see where the confliction is?
I don't.
You have to see where the confliction is. You're a smart guy. You have to see where I'm confused now. All of a sudden, you want to know what happened to her, but all of a sudden you seem to not care. She's carrying your baby and you seem to not care.
You said I could go.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you're free to go.
I'm sorry. Look.
Okay. You want to wait out in the lobby and I'll have Matt come out and...
I just...
In our eyes, at that point, he did nothing to completely eliminate himself. His girlfriend that he supposedly loves is missing. And instead, he's worried about himself.
You're probably upset with me or whatever, but I don't want you.
On top of that, he's the last person to see her alive. When you start adding all those pieces of the puzzle together, we believe that he's responsible for her disappearance. We just can't prove it.
It's not a waste of time for me, because, you know,
No,
like I said, I really want to find out what happened to her.
We waited and we waited and never knew if that day would come where we would know what actually happened. You know, in my heart, I was still hoping that she was somewhere, but I knew if she could reach out to us, that she would have.
At that point, we're pretty much in cold case mode when all of a sudden we start getting telephone calls from friends and family of Bethany Decker. They're reporting to us that Bethany was contacting them on Facebook, but they start to wonder if she's the one sending the messages.
I was scared. I was getting messages that didn't quite seem like her, you know, calling me sis and just talking really negatively about her family, which isn't something that Bethany would do.
A review of the messages suggested that someone's impersonating her. But we were having a very difficult time tracing the IP addresses off of these particular messages. None of our efforts seemed to move the case forward. We get a telephone call from the Pinehurst Police Department in North Carolina. They notified us that Ronald Roldan had shot his new girlfriend, Vicki Willoughby.
We learned they had gotten into a domestic dispute. He began choking her and shot him 2 times in the chest. He then took the firearm from her and ended up shooting her in the head with a bullet going through her eye.
They said Vicki had survived and that Roldan had been cleared from the hospital and he was going to be standing trial for a charge of assault with a deadly weapon in North Carolina. And the moment that she knew she was safe, she said to them, "You need to call the police. In Virginia, he's involved in Bethany Decker's disappearance."
This is Investigator Kip Dennis with the Moore County District Attorney's Office. I'm in here with Detective Mark Bush with the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office from Virginia.
When I met Vicki Willoughby, she was post-surgery, laying in the hospital bed. She stated to me that she wanted justice for Bethany, that she had been scared to tell anybody up until this point because she feared the physical assault from Ronald.
So wait, I'm going to tell you guys all this stuff, and then he's going to know I told. How long can they keep him in jail for attempted? He tried to kill me, right?
He's been charged with the equivalent in North Carolina of attempted murder. And I can't tell you what he'll get. I don't know.
He won't go for life. He didn't kill me. He killed her and got away with it.
Yeah. Okay, and when you say her...
Bethany.
Where did you hear about
Well,
Bethany?
One night I was at my friend's house. He heard that Ronald was involved in a murder case. And so we looked it up online, and I confronted Ronald. And he got real quiet, and then after that he was like, "What the f***? Are you accusing me like everybody else?" And he flipped out, so of course I was like, no, And I knew to be afraid of him ever since that moment. I think she was raped and strangled, choked to death. Because sometimes during sex, Ronald would try to choke me.
Okay.
And I didn't understand that. He said I could kill you right now if I wanted to.
There's one, there's...
Oh, he's gonna know I said all this stuff. Now I gotta walk around scared the rest of my life. It's scary.
Unfortunately, she didn't know any of the details that we would need in order to facilitate a prosecution for Bethany Decker.
But what we can definitely glean is that he's a violent, murderous person with women. And it gives us more circumstantial evidence, if we could get it in trial, that this is his history.
Based upon Vicki's statement, we're almost certain that he's strangled Bethany to death. So we decided to make this as an opportunity to re-interview Roldan.
I was very excited to go down and talk to Ronald. I'll try what I call the Dutch uncle. Let me offer you some help and maybe strike a nerve or a heartstring and see if he'll give me a statement or a confession. How you doing?
Good, how are you?
All right. Well, I'm a detective. I'm from Loudoun County, Virginia.
Okay.
So, two things. I'd like to talk to you about the Bethany Ann Decker case. It's never going to go away. And I'd also like to offer you some help. Because I think, you know, this last incident with the girl down here, what's her name, Vicky? I think you're headed for a bad spot. I don't know you from Adam, but looking at the history, if there's something in you that's causing you this hatred or anger that flares up, it ain't gonna go away, kid. And that's why I'm coming down here to see if you want to talk about Bethany and Decker. I'm just, you know, I'm looking at it. I'm looking at help to find this poor girl, you know, right. And maybe if she is dead, maybe letting her mother bury her, you know. Right. I don't know if she's dead or not, but I'm thinking she's dead.
I hear what you're saying.
Can you tell me back in 2011, the last day when Bethany was around, what was going on?
I've already talked about this. You know,
yeah, I know.
And there's nothing more I have to say. And if you have any further questions, you can just contact my attorney.
All right. I don't have a problem with that. I'm going to leave you with this.
Sure.
For people that have involvement in a heinous crime, it's extremely difficult for those people to live with it forever. I've seen them commit suicide, and I've seen them, you know, just go off the deep end. If you don't want that to happen, and if you know anything, the door's always open, all right? Basically, he shut me down. You don't take it personal. And this isn't going to go away. All right, man. Take it easy. But after it was over, it looked like he wiped a tear away from his eye. And it just gave me some insight that maybe something struck a chord in his heart or his mind that said, you know, I feel bad.
It's extremely frustrating that you put in all these years of effort and to know that it's unsolved.
This inmate says we were drinking homemade moonshine in their adjoining cells. Roldan was drunk and made an admission. Ronald Roldan said, I killed my old lady, and I think she was pregnant with my kid. Now we have Roldan confessing to someone while he's in jail that he killed Bethany Decker, and this was when she was pregnant with Ronald's baby. This inmate didn't think that was right. They have a code, and this was beyond his code, so he's willing to testify.
It's extremely difficult when you have a case that does not have a body, does not have DNA or an eyewitness. We needed to find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt to sustain a conviction.
By the time spring of 2019 rolls around, I'm starting to dabble in a few of our cold cases. We knew Roldan was going to be released on the charges from North Carolina. My boss assigned it to me to work as a full-time case to try to bring it to some type of resolution first. We had to rely on what was already obtained by the original detectives, and one of the things they were able to recover was Ronald Roldan's MacBook computer. So at that point, I remembered someone was on Facebook impersonating Bethany after she's disappeared.
That computer was ultimately examined, and they were able to discover what was called DATR cookie hits. And they were able to establish that Ronald's computer was accessing Bethany's Facebook account after she disappeared. The only reasonable conclusion is that he was impersonating her.
So now I could go before a court and strongly testify to the fact that Ronald is keeping her from her friends and family or not disclosing where her remains are. So I got the authorization to go get a warrant charging Ronald Roldan with abduction of Bethany Decker. He was extradited back up to Virginia.
Our office made the determination that the evidence necessary to prove an abduction would also establish a homicide. At that point, the charges were elevated to second-degree murder.
It was an exhilarating moment, but we were not across the finish line yet. The defense reached out. They wanted to participate in a plea agreement. I was hoping, beyond all hope, that he would tell us the location of Bethany's remains and give some modicum of peace to the family.
Everything was thoroughly discussed by Bethany's family. Their wishes were the most important thing to me, in addition to having a conviction.
The plea deal seemed like the right thing to do. It would have been very difficult to put the family through a long, drawn-out trial.
We really think that no amount of time could really replace the life of Bethany and her baby. But for us, it was important to our family to have some answers in knowing what had happened.
During the debrief, myself and Ms. Clark Nelson were able to ask him questions, and his defense attorneys were present with him.
It was the most nerve-wracking thing that I have done. I did not want to appear overly combative to begin, because that may have created a space where he was not as open with what he did with her body.
All right, good morning. First of all, thank you very much for agreeing to speak with us today. If you could just kind of walk us through what you remember about January 29th, 2011.
At some point, we got an argument. Ultimately, I didn't want her to go to work. She's like, I have to go to work. And, at some point during the argument, she was trying to walk away from the conversation. I pushed her. And when I pushed her, she tripped over like her feet and hit the windowsill.
What hit the windowsill?
Right?
Okay.
Like in the middle of the head or the
Like
forehead?
Somewhere around.
Okay. Then what happened next?
She was on the floor, and to her, I put my fingers by her nose, and she wasn't breathing.
Is there some reason why you didn't try to call 911 for her at that point?
I was scared, just panicked.
Did you try CPR or anything to try and get her to breathe again?
No.
What did you think was going to happen if you called 911?
I was gonna get arrested.
He wants us to believe that it was an accident, but his statements don't seem to be adding up.
The human response should be to seek help. but there was no efforts to revive. There was no efforts to resuscitate. There was no efforts to call for help.
I don't remember a lot of things from that day.
What's the last thing that Bethany says to you?
I was going through a lot at that time. I was just,
What happened next?
I don't remember what happened exactly after that, but at some point, there was an aid bag in the apartment for Christmas tree removal, and I just put her inside of the bag. I went outside, and I took the bag to the trash. It just has this like a sliding door, little like sliding door. After that, I closed it, just walked back.
We believe that he's being truthful about what happened to her remains because he's so detailed. There's almost a slight smirk to his face when he starts telling that information. But he is completely fabricating everything up until the point that he puts her in the trash bag. At that point, the cop in me just wanted to let him know that he had fooled nobody. I've never seen a single case where someone hits their head on the corner of a windowsill and then ends up dead within a couple of minutes. There's no attempt to try and stop not just her death, but the death of the unborn child. So I'm having a hard time believing that that's the only thing that happens, because I don't think that adds up as to how she died. He didn't want to be cooperating. He just thought this was what he had to do to get the deal that he had agreed to. And I wanted him to understand that after all these years, we knew exactly what occurred.
This is one of the reasons why I stopped talking to investigators, because when they first started talking to me, they said this, which is not true. So if you're putting words in my mouth, I'm not going to continue to talk to you.
Okay, so they treated you unfair. You stopped cooperating. So your statement is that you got into an argument, she gets pushed, she hits her head. We didn't find any blood inside of the apartment near that window. We didn't find any markings or scrapings on that window. I think it's more likely that you choked her out. And then a couple of weeks later, we've got you impersonating her online, and that appeared to be a cover-up of what occurred. Is that correct? Is there anything you want to change about your story of pushing her? I believe that we got the absolute most information for the family that we possibly could. As detectives, we all agree that she was killed in that apartment, that she was strangled because they got into an argument, and that he placed her in that bag, put her in the trash compactor, and sent her off like common trash. We'll be concluding the proper session. Thank you for your time. This one's just hit the button here.
At the end of the day, we gave Bethany's family an opportunity to fully digest the fact that Bethany is no longer missing, but she's actually murdered by Ronald Roldan.
We figured out that the dumpster where he disposed of her remains would have been taken to a local transfer station, driven down I-95, and it would have ended up in a waste management landfill in King George County. We're talking well over 150 acres worth of land. And then to add on that 12 years of time and decomposition, compression, the likelihood of recovering any remains is slim to none.
There were efforts to try and recover her. Unfortunately, we were not able to recover her body.
It was really difficult, but we are grateful that they did everything they could. After all of these years, there was justice for Bethany. They made that happen. I can't tell you how hard it was knowing that when we had our last Christmas, that would be the last one. And so I just want to encourage each and every one of you not to take for granted tomorrow.
This was a profound case. It's a case that a lot of people worked on, and we would not be here today but for the efforts of everyone.
She was smart. She was bold. She was beautiful. And that loss of someone that I admire and love so much, it leaves kind of a hole in your heart.
I miss everything about her. I miss that she was one of the few people in my life that loved me for me.
She brought happiness and she brought joy to me and to our family. And I smile when I think back about those memories. That helps keep her memory alive.
Mười chín năm sau, ADN vạch mặt Indiva Killer. Gary Ridgway, Washington. Part 1. There are crimes that terrify a city for a night. And then there are crimes that change the identity of a place forever. In Washington state, there was a river that became a graveyard. The Green River moved quietly through the landscape south of Seattle. Water passed beneath bridges. Trees lined the banks. Roads carried commuters to work. Trucks moved through the industrial corridors. People drove past without knowing what was hidden only yards away. Then, in the summer of 1982, everything changed. On July 15th, a body was found in the Green River. Her name was Wendy Lee Caulfield. She was young. She had a family. She had a life that should have continued. Instead, her body became the first known piece of a nightmare that would haunt investigators for nearly 2 decades. Within weeks, more bodies appeared. Deborah Lynn Bonner, Marcia Faye Chapman, Opal Charmaine Mills, Cynthia Jean Hines. 5 women, 5 discoveries, 1 river. And suddenly, detectives were no longer investigating isolated murders. They were facing something much larger. A killer was moving through the community, and he appeared to understand exactly how vulnerable his victims were. The first headlines were terrifying. Women were disappearing. Bodies were being discovered near the river. Investigators searched wooded areas, roadsides, abandoned spaces, and stretches of water. Every new discovery seemed to produce another question. How many victims were there? Where had they been killed? Why had their bodies been left there? And most importantly, who was doing this? The investigation became one of the largest and longest serial murder investigations in American history. Detectives worked around the clock. Evidence was collected. Photographs were taken. Witnesses were interviewed. Names were written down. Leads were followed. Some collapsed within hours. Others survived for months. The killer seemed to exist somewhere inside the same world as the people hunting him. He could have been driving the same roads, buying the same groceries, standing in the same lines, passing the same police cars. That possibility made the investigation even more frightening. The killer was not a monster hiding in some distant wilderness. He was apparently living among ordinary people. And while investigators searched for him, the river continued to move. That was the cruelest part. Water does not preserve secrets forever, but sometimes it preserves them long enough. For years, detectives tried to understand the pattern. The victims were not simply names on a list. Each one had friends, families, habits, dreams, people who expected them to come home. Some had disappeared after being seen on the streets. Others were last known to be in areas where vulnerable women were often targeted. The investigation quickly became complicated by the sheer number of disappearances. There were missing person reports. There were unidentified remains. There were conflicting witness accounts. There were countless possibilities. And there was one terrifying certainty. Someone knew more than they were saying. In those early years, forensic science was nowhere near what would become decades later. DNA profiling was not yet the powerful investigative tool it would become. Evidence that might eventually prove decisive could sit quietly in an evidence room, waiting for technology to catch up. Investigators did not know that one day biological evidence in the case would speak with a clarity that witnesses could not. They did not know that a microscopic trace would eventually point toward a man who had spent years appearing ordinary. His name was Gary Leon Ridgway. At the time, however, Ridgway was not the answer. He was simply another man living in Washington. A worker. A husband. A person who could disappear into the background of everyday life. The investigation continued. Years passed. The Green River became synonymous with fear. Parents warned their daughters. Communities watched the roads. Families waited for answers. Detectives carried photographs. Names accumulated. Some victims were found. Others remained missing. The case grew colder. But cold did not mean dead. Because evidence does not understand time. A witness may forget. A suspect may lie. A memory may disappear. But DNA can remain. And somewhere inside the enormous Green River investigation, evidence existed that had not yet revealed its full meaning. The killer had left something behind. He simply did not know it. For nearly 19 years, investigators would continue chasing a shadow. Then science caught up. And when it did, the man behind one of America's most notorious serial murder cases would finally have a name. Gary Ridgway. The Green River Killer. But before that name became public, before the arrest, before the courtroom, before the confession, there were 19 years of uncertainty. 19 years of families waiting. 19 years of investigators refusing to let the case disappear. And 19 years during which the killer lived a seemingly ordinary life while one of the largest manhunts in Washington history continued around him. The river kept moving. The victims remained silent. And the evidence waited. Part 2. The first mistake people make when looking back at the Green River case is imagining that investigators simply failed to find the killer. The truth was far more complicated. The investigation was enormous. The number of possible suspects was enormous. And the amount of information pouring into the case was overwhelming. Every missing woman created another possibility. Every body created another crime scene. Every phone call could contain the clue that finally broke the case. Or nothing at all. Detectives were working in an era before modern forensic databases could instantly compare evidence across jurisdictions. Information had to be collected, cataloged, typed, filed, cross-checked, sometimes by hand. The investigators were chasing a killer who appeared to understand how to avoid leaving obvious evidence. The victims were often vulnerable women. That vulnerability made the case even more difficult. Some had histories that made their disappearances less likely to trigger immediate alarms. Others vanished in circumstances where there were few reliable witnesses. The killer appeared to exploit exactly that. He did not need a spectacular crime scene. He needed opportunity. He needed isolation. He needed time. And he needed his victims to be overlooked. That became one of the darkest themes of the investigation. The victims were disappearing from the margins of society, but their families knew they mattered. Detectives knew they mattered, and the killer knew they mattered least to the people around them. That was enough. As bodies were discovered, investigators began searching for connections. The Green River itself became one. But the river was not necessarily where the crimes occurred. It was where the killer chose to leave evidence of what he had done. That distinction mattered. If the victims had been killed somewhere else, the crime scenes were elsewhere too. That meant investigators were searching for two locations, where the victims disappeared and where their bodies were found. The distance between those places could be the difference between a breakthrough and another dead end. Investigators questioned truck drivers, residents, friends, family members, people who worked near the river, people who had seen suspicious vehicles, people who remembered unusual behavior. The list of possibilities expanded, then narrowed, then expanded again. Rumors spread. Some people became convinced they knew the killer. Others suspected strangers. Still others feared someone they knew. The community was caught between paranoia and helplessness. And through it all, the killer remained unidentified. The case eventually attracted enormous attention. The name Green River Killer became a symbol. It was short, memorable, terrifying. But behind the name were individual women whose lives had been reduced in the public imagination to a serial killer's victim list. Investigators refused to let that happen. They kept working. Evidence was preserved. Old leads were revisited. Technology improved. The passage of time, which normally destroys a criminal investigation, began to work in another direction. Science was changing. DNA analysis was becoming increasingly powerful. Evidence that might once have been considered too small or too degraded could now be examined differently. The Green River investigation was no longer only a traditional police investigation. It was becoming a forensic one. That transformation would eventually change everything. But first, investigators needed a sample. They needed a comparison. They needed something from a suspect that could be matched against biological evidence connected to a victim. For years, the suspect remained unidentified. Then came Ridgway. He had been interviewed during the investigation. He was not an unknown figure in the broader world surrounding the case. He had crossed the investigator's path before. But suspicion is not proof, and investigators needed proof. That distinction became critical, because a man could look suspicious. He could behave strangely. He could have a connection to the area. He could even have been questioned before. None of that was enough. The evidence had to speak, and DNA offered something the investigation had been missing: a direct biological link. In 2001, nearly 2 decades after the first bodies were found, investigators were able to compare preserved evidence with a DNA sample associated with Ridgway. The result changed the case. The evidence pointed toward him. The ordinary man who had existed in the background of Washington life was no longer simply a person of interest. He became the central suspect. The investigation moved rapidly. Police had spent years searching for the killer. Now they had something far more powerful than a rumor. They had science. On November 30th, 2001, Gary Ridgway was arrested. The arrest was not the end of the story. It was the moment when the story finally began to make sense. Because investigators now had the man. But they still had questions. How many victims? Why them? Where were the others? And how much had Ridgway hidden? The public had spent 19 years imagining the Green River Killer as a faceless predator. Now the face was finally visible, and it was disturbingly ordinary. That was perhaps the most unsettling revelation of all. The killer had not been hiding behind a mask. He had been living inside the community, working, driving, speaking to people, passing through everyday life. While investigators searched for a monster, the monster had been performing normality. Then came the interrogation, and the questions that had waited 19 years finally had somewhere to go. Part 3. Gary Ridgway's arrest shocked the region. But for investigators, the shock was accompanied by something else. Relief. For 19 years, the case had been a maze. Now there was a center. Gary Ridgway. A name. A face. A suspect. And potentially a connection to dozens of women whose families had spent years waiting for answers. But investigators knew something immediately. Arresting Ridgway was not the same as proving every murder. The case was enormous. The victims were many. The evidence varied. Some remains had been badly degraded by time. Some victims had never been found. Some disappearances had never been conclusively linked to the Green River murders. The investigation, therefore, entered a new phase. Instead of asking only, "Who is the killer?" detectives could now ask Ridgway directly. "What did you do?" The answers would become part of one of the most disturbing interrogations in American criminal history. Ridgway's cooperation came with conditions. In 2003, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty in exchange for his guilty plea and his agreement to provide complete and truthful information about the murders he committed in King County. That agreement changed the investigation. Ridgway could no longer simply remain silent behind a courtroom defense. He was expected to talk, and detectives needed him to talk, because there were families who did not want theories. They wanted names. They wanted locations. They wanted remains. They wanted to know what happened to daughters, sisters, and mothers who had vanished decades earlier. For investigators, every interview became a search through memory. Every detail could matter. A road. A vehicle. A building. A stretch of forest. A riverbank. A name. A date. A forgotten location. The Green River case had become a map of Washington State, and Ridgway knew parts of that map intimately. The interrogation process revealed just how extensive the investigation needed to be. Ridgway was eventually linked to numerous murders, but the number of victims remained one of the most difficult questions. In November 2003, he pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. That number alone was staggering. 48 lives, 48 families, 48 separate stories ending in the same investigation. And yet, even after the guilty pleas, investigators knew the number might not represent everything. Ridgway had admitted to 48 murders. Authorities suspected there could be more. That possibility remains part of the case's enduring mystery, because serial killers often leave behind uncertainty. Not every victim is recovered. Not every disappearance is reported. Not every case can be conclusively connected. And not every confession can be independently verified in every detail. The Green River investigation, therefore, did not simply end with a guilty plea. It expanded. Investigators used Ridgway's statements to search for remains. Some searches led nowhere. Others produced answers. The work was slow. Physical evidence had to be located. Locations had to be examined. Families had to be notified. Records had to be checked. And investigators had to separate fact from memory. Time had passed. Landscapes had changed. Roads had been rebuilt. Buildings had disappeared. Trees had grown. The Washington landscape of 1982 was not the same landscape investigators encountered in the 21st century. That made every search harder. But Ridgway's knowledge gave investigators something they had never had before: a human guide through the mystery. For years, police had been trying to infer what the killer had done. Now, they could compare those theories with information coming from the man who had committed the crimes. But the process also exposed something deeply unsettling. Ridgway had been able to maintain an ordinary existence for years. The public often imagined serial killers as visibly abnormal. Ridgway challenged that assumption. He could appear unremarkable. He could hold a job. He could interact with neighbors. He could exist in everyday spaces. That ordinariness had helped conceal him. The DNA evidence had done what intuition could not. It had converted suspicion into identification. And that is why the 2001 breakthrough remained so important. The case had not been solved by one dramatic eyewitness. It had not been solved because a neighbor suddenly remembered everything. It was solved because technology gave investigators a way to connect old evidence to a living suspect. The past had finally reached the present. The biological evidence collected years earlier had survived long enough to matter. That is the strange power of forensic science. A killer can forget. A killer can deny. A killer can move. But evidence can wait. And the evidence had waited 19 years. Still, the arrest created a new kind of horror. Families began to understand that the man they had feared for nearly 2 decades had actually been living among them. He had not been a ghost. He had been real. He had been reachable. He had been somewhere. And perhaps the most painful question was the simplest one. How many opportunities had existed to stop him? That question would never have an easy answer, because investigations are built from information. And information arrives slowly, sometimes too slowly. The Green River case became a lesson in what happens when a criminal investigation collides with limited technology, vulnerable victims, fragmented information, and an offender capable of hiding behind an ordinary life. The arrest brought certainty, but it also revealed how much uncertainty remained. Some women were still missing. Some identities were still unresolved. And some families were still waiting. Part 4. The Green River investigation was never only about Gary Ridgway. That is one of the most important truths buried beneath the headline. The name of the killer became famous. The victims became numbers. But the case began with individual lives. Women who had names. Women whose families remembered their voices. Women who had favorite foods, favorite songs, arguments, jokes, fears, and plans. Then they disappeared. The public often remembers serial murder through the killer. The Green River case demands that we remember the victims first. Wendy Lee Caulfield, Deborah Lynn Bonner, Marcia Faye Chapman, Opal Charmaine Mills, Cynthia Jean Hines. Their names were among the first to become associated with the investigation. The river had carried their bodies into public view. But before the river, there had been lives. That distinction matters, because the killer wanted his victims to disappear. Investigators spent decades doing the opposite. They gave them names. They photographed evidence. They built case files. They searched locations. They contacted relatives. They refused to let the victims become anonymous. The investigation also revealed the particular vulnerability of women living on the margins. Some victims had struggled with unstable circumstances. Some were involved in prostitution or survival sex. Some were young. Some had histories that made them easier for society to overlook. That created a dangerous environment. When someone disappears from a stable household, alarms may ring immediately. When someone disappears from a chaotic environment, the response can be slower. That difference can be deadly. Ridgway understood opportunity. He was not necessarily searching for the most protected person. He was looking for people whose disappearance might not immediately trigger the full force of society. That is one reason the Green River murders became so difficult to stop. The killer exploited vulnerability, and he exploited the gaps between people, between families and police, between jurisdictions, between missing person reports and homicide investigations, between what someone knew and what someone was willing to tell investigators. The investigation became a race against time. But time was not on the side of the victims. Every passing day made evidence harder to recover. Every passing year changed memories. Every new construction project altered landscapes. Every death of a witness potentially erased another piece of the puzzle. Yet the case continued. The detectives changed. Technology changed. The public changed. But the files remained. The evidence remained. The unanswered questions remained. And then in 2001, DNA transformed the case. The science did not bring the victims back. It did something else. It gave investigators a direction. Ridgway's DNA connection provided the bridge between the evidence of the past and the suspect of the present. Forensic science had effectively reached backward through 19 years. That is why the case became such an important example of cold case investigation. A cold case is not necessarily an abandoned case. Sometimes it is a case waiting for the right technology. Sometimes it is waiting for a new witness. Sometimes it is waiting for a database match. Sometimes it is waiting for a suspect to make one mistake. And sometimes it is waiting for science to become capable of answering a question that investigators could not answer when the crime occurred. The Green River case contained all of those elements. The arrest of Ridgway also changed the emotional landscape for families. Some finally had answers. Some learned where loved ones had been taken. Some received remains. Some learned details they had feared for years. But answers can hurt. An unanswered disappearance allows families to imagine possibilities. A confirmed murder destroys those possibilities. There is no return. No miracle. No sudden phone call from a lost daughter. Only the truth. And sometimes the truth is unbearable. Ridgway's guilty plea removed one uncertainty. He was a Green River killer. But another uncertainty remained. Was he responsible for every disappearance associated with the investigation? Investigators could not automatically say yes. A serial killer can be responsible for crimes that were never discovered. But investigators also cannot simply assign every unsolved disappearance to one suspect without evidence. That distinction matters. The official record identifies 48 murders, to which Ridgway pleaded guilty. Yet the investigation continued to examine other cases. 3 women listed by King County remain missing, and their cases remain uncharged. Cassie and Lee was 16 when she disappeared in 1982. Kelly K. McGinnis was 18 when she disappeared in 1983. Another woman, who had been connected to the investigation, also remained missing. Their stories demonstrate something important. Even when a serial killer is identified, the mystery may not completely disappear. The Green River killer was caught. But the Green River investigation was never simply a single criminal case. It became an archive of missing people, unidentified remains, unanswered family questions, and evidence that may still contain information. The river itself became almost symbolic. For years, it had been associated with death. But it also became associated with discovery. Bodies that had been hidden were found. Names that had been forgotten were restored. And evidence that seemed useless eventually helped expose the man responsible. The killer had counted on time. He was wrong. Time had not erased everything. Somewhere inside old evidence was a clue that would eventually lead detectives to him. The case had been cold, but it had never truly been silent. Part 5. November 30th, 2001, was the day the long shadow finally took human form. Gary Ridgway was arrested. The man investigators had been trying to identify for nearly 19 years was suddenly in custody. The news traveled quickly. The Green River Killer had been caught. For families, the headline carried an almost impossible mixture of emotions: shock, relief, fear, anger, and grief. For detectives, the arrest represented the beginning of a different kind of investigation. Now, they had to prove the case. Now they had to understand the full scope of Ridgway's crimes. Now they had to locate victims. Now they had to determine whether there were other cases connected to him. And now Ridgway himself became the source of information. He had spent years avoiding the consequences of his actions. Suddenly, the walls were closing in. DNA had changed everything. Without that biological link, the case might have remained unresolved for much longer. The technology was powerful because it did not depend on Ridgway's cooperation. It did not care what he said. It did not care what he remembered. It did not care how ordinary he appeared. DNA could connect evidence to a person. That was enough to bring the investigation to his doorstep. But investigators still needed to build the larger picture. A serial murder case is not solved by identifying one suspect. Each victim requires evidence. Each charge requires proof. Each location requires verification. And every family deserves certainty. Ridgway's cooperation therefore became central. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he agreed to plead guilty and provide truthful information about his crimes in King County. The agreement opened the door to years of investigative work. Detectives interviewed him extensively. They asked about victims. They asked about locations. They asked about dates. They asked about where bodies had been left. They asked about places he remembered. The interviews were not simple. Human memory is imperfect. A killer may remember some details clearly and others vaguely. Locations can change. Roads can disappear. Landmarks can move. And investigators must verify what they are told. Ridgway's statements therefore became leads, not automatic facts. Each piece had to be tested. Search teams went into areas that had once seemed impossible to identify. Some searches were successful. Others produced nothing. That was the nature of the case. Even with the killer speaking, answers did not always come easily. The investigation had become a battle against geography and time. Imagine a location from 1982. Now imagine standing there more than 20 years later. The trees are taller. The roads are different. New buildings have appeared. Old buildings are gone. A field may have become a parking lot. A dirt road may have become pavement. A familiar landmark may have disappeared completely. The investigator must reconstruct a landscape that no longer exists. That is what made the Green River case so difficult. It was not only a murder investigation. It was an archaeological excavation of memory. Ridgway's guilty plea in 2003 provided an enormous amount of information, but it also raised a question that continues to fascinate investigators and the public. How many victims were there really? The official number connected through his guilty plea was 48. That alone made him one of the most prolific known serial killers in American history. But investigators have long considered the possibility that he may have killed more women than those officially charged. That possibility is not the same as proof. It is a reason to keep investigating. The distinction is critical. A cold case should not become a dumping ground for unanswered mysteries. Each case deserves evidence. Each victim deserves an independent investigation. Each family deserves the truth. The Green River investigation showed why. The killer's identity was known. His crimes were known. His confession was known. But some disappearances remain outside the boundaries of what prosecutors could prove. That meant the investigation could not simply close its doors and declare victory. The detectives continued looking. The families continued waiting. And the official case files continued growing. For the public, the story had a beginning and an end. The river. The bodies. The manhunt. The DNA breakthrough. The arrest. The guilty plea. But for investigators, there was no clean ending. There were still names. Still missing women. Still evidence. Still unanswered questions. That is the reality of many major criminal investigations. The courtroom can deliver a verdict, but it cannot always deliver every answer. Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Green River killer would never walk free again. But imprisonment did not erase the past. It did not restore the victims. It did not heal every family. And it did not answer every disappearance. The man had finally been caught. The mystery had been partially solved. But partial answers can create new questions. And in the Green River case, there were many. Part 6. For 19 years, the investigation had depended heavily on traditional police work, interviews, surveillance, searches, records, physical evidence, dedication, persistence. But the final breakthrough came from something that could not speak. DNA. The science had existed in its developing form long before Ridgway's arrest, but its power had grown dramatically. A tiny biological trace could become a fingerprint of identity. In the Green River case, that possibility became reality. The significance of the breakthrough was enormous. The killer had believed the years were protecting him. Instead, the years had preserved evidence. That is a paradox of cold cases. Time destroys some clues. But time can also create new opportunities. Databases become larger. Laboratories become more sophisticated. Scientists develop better methods. Investigators learn new techniques. A sample that could not answer a question in 1982 may answer it in 2001. That is what happened with Ridgway. His arrest became a demonstration of the power of forensic science. But DNA did not work alone. Behind the science were investigators who had kept the evidence alive. Behind them were families who continued demanding answers. Behind them were the original detectives who refused to accept that the case would remain permanently unsolved. That continuity mattered. Cold cases are often described as dormant, but investigators know better. Evidence may sit untouched for years. The investigation may become less visible, but the case file remains. The names remain. The photographs remain. The laboratory results remain. And somewhere inside that material may be the clue that future investigators need. The Green River case became a symbol of that principle. The killer had counted on the passage of time. He underestimated science. But there was another factor he underestimated. Memory. Not perfect memory. Not always reliable memory. But the accumulated memory of an entire investigation. One witness remembers a vehicle. Another remembers a location. Another remembers a face. A family remembers the last phone call. A detective remembers an interview. A laboratory technician preserves evidence. None of these pieces is necessarily enough alone. Together, they can become a pattern. The Green River investigation was built from thousands of such fragments, and Ridgway's eventual identification allowed investigators to reinterpret many of them. Old leads could be reconsidered. Old evidence could be tested. Old questions could be asked again. This is one of the most important lessons of the case. A suspect does not merely answer questions. A suspect can change the meaning of evidence collected years earlier. Once Ridgway was identified, investigators could look backward. They could ask whether previous encounters with him had been significant. They could revisit information that had seemed irrelevant. They could compare his movements with known disappearances. They could search for connections. The past was no longer a collection of isolated events. It became a network. And at the center was Ridgway. Yet there is something deeply disturbing about how long he remained outside that center. He was not living in another country. He was not hiding in a remote jungle. He was not constantly changing identities. He was living an ordinary life in Washington. That is what makes the case so psychologically unsettling. The greatest danger may not always look dangerous. Sometimes it looks ordinary. Sometimes it speaks politely. Sometimes it goes to work. Sometimes it lives in a neighborhood where people recognize its face. That ordinariness can become camouflage. And the Green River Killer used it for years. The case also changed the way investigators viewed missing person reports. Every disappearance matters. Every vulnerable person matters. Every report can contain information that becomes critical years later. The victims of the Green River case had sometimes been treated by society as people who could disappear without immediate consequence. The investigation proved the opposite. Their disappearances became the center of one of the largest criminal investigations in the region. Their names became part of history. Their families became part of the fight for answers. And their evidence eventually helped expose their killer. The river had once been the killer's hiding place. In time, it became his greatest liability. Because every body found there created another piece of evidence. Every victim created another investigation. Every investigation preserved another record. And eventually those records converged. The killer had created a pattern. Science revealed the pattern. Then police identified the person at its center. That is how a 19-year mystery collapsed. Not in one dramatic moment, but through years of accumulated work. A piece of evidence here. A report there. A preserved sample. A new forensic method. A comparison. A match. And finally, an arrest. Part 7. The public often imagines a serial killer case ending with handcuffs. But for families, the handcuffs are only the beginning. When Gary Ridgway was arrested, some families finally knew who had taken their loved ones. But knowing the killer's name does not erase grief. It can make grief sharper. For years, families had lived with uncertainty. Was she alive? Was she somewhere else? Would she call? Would someone find her? Then the answer came. She was dead. And the man responsible had been identified. There is a cruelty in that finality. But there is also something important. Truth gives families something uncertainty never can. A place to put their grief. The Green River investigation became a long process of identifying victims and recovering information. Some women have been found years earlier. Others remained unidentified for long periods. Some were eventually connected to the case. Others remain missing. This is why the Green River case cannot be reduced to Ridgway's 48 guilty pleas. The official investigation continues to have a second mission. Identify the women. Find the missing. Give families answers. King County continues to list missing women connected to the broader Green River investigation. Some remain missing today. Their cases remain uncharged. That means the story is not completely finished. The killer was caught, but the investigation still contains unanswered chapters. One of the missing women was Cassie Ann Lee. She was 16 years old when she disappeared in August 1982. Another was Kelly Kay McGinnis. She was 18 when she disappeared in June 1983. Their names remain connected to the investigation. Their families do not have the closure that the Ridgway arrest provided to others. That distinction is important. A famous cold case can be solved in the public imagination while individual mysteries remain unsolved. The headline says the killer was caught, but a family may still be asking where their daughter is. That is the difference between solving a case and solving every question inside it. The Green River investigation demonstrates that difference with brutal clarity. There is also another question. How many victims were there? Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 murders. He was sentenced to life without parole. But investigators have considered the possibility that he may have killed additional women. Again, possibility is not proof. The distinction must remain, but it explains why investigators continued examining cases beyond the convictions. Serial murder investigations rarely fit neatly into legal categories. A prosecutor can only charge what can be proven. A detective can investigate what can reasonably be connected. A family can suspect what happened without having evidence strong enough for court. These are three different realities. The Green River case contained all three. That is why the investigation remained so complex even after the arrest. The public wanted a final number. 48? More? Less? The answer depends on what standard is being applied. The legal record is clear. Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 murders. The broader historical question is less certain. And that uncertainty is precisely why the case continues to attract attention. The Green River Killer became one of America's most notorious serial murderers. But the case is also a study in investigative persistence. Detectives who worked the case over decades did not know whether they would ever see an arrest. They did not know whether the evidence would survive. They did not know whether technology would improve quickly enough. They did not know whether the killer would ever confess. Yet they continued. That persistence matters because cold cases can be emotionally exhausting. Every year without an arrest can feel like another victory for the offender. But investigators do not measure time the same way. A case can remain viable for decades. Evidence can be retested. Records can be digitized. Databases can be expanded. Scientific techniques can improve. A suspect can make a mistake. And sometimes the person who thought he had escaped simply has not escaped yet. Ridgway's case is one of the clearest examples. He had lived for years believing that the past was behind him. Then forensic science reopened it. The evidence did not forget. The victims did not disappear completely. The case did not die. It waited. That is why the phrase cold case can be misleading. Cold does not mean frozen forever. It means unresolved. And unresolved does not mean unsolvable. For the Green River investigation, 19 years separated the first known murder discoveries from Ridgway's arrest. 19 years is long enough for children to become adults, for neighborhoods to change, for witnesses to age, for detectives to retire, for memories to fade. And yet the evidence remained powerful enough to expose a killer. That is the legacy of the case. Not simply the horror, not simply the number of victims, but the lesson that time does not always protect a criminal. Sometimes time becomes a witness. Part 8. There is a particular image that has become inseparable from the Green River case. Water. Moving water. Dark water. A river flowing past trees and roads, while people went about their daily lives. The river did not speak, but it revealed. The bodies discovered there transformed a landscape into a symbol of fear. For residents, familiar places became frightening. A roadside, a wooded area, a bridge, a riverbank. Ordinary geography became associated with murder. That is what serial crime does to communities. It changes the emotional map. A place that once meant nothing suddenly carries memory. Years later, people may drive to the same area and remember what happened there. They may not know every detail, but they remember the feeling. The Green River investigation created that kind of memory. The victims became part of the geography, and the killer became part of the history. But Ridgway's arrest did not erase the fear. It transformed it. People now knew the identity of the man responsible for crimes. The unknown had become known. In some ways, that is less frightening. In other ways, it is more disturbing. Because the killer was not a supernatural figure. He was human. He had a face. He had a routine. He existed within society. The realization forced people to reconsider what danger actually looks like. For investigators, Ridgway's confession and guilty pleas created an extraordinary opportunity. They could finally ask questions that had been impossible before. Where? When? Who? Why? What happened afterward? The answers were difficult. Some were incomplete. Some led to locations. Some led to searches. Some led to nothing. But each answer could potentially give a family something it had never had: certainty. That is why the investigation continued after the arrest. The police were no longer hunting the killer. They were recovering the victims. The difference is enormous. The first phase was about stopping the threat. The second was about restoring identity. A victim cannot speak. So investigators must speak for the victim. They must prove who she was. They must establish what happened. They must connect evidence. They must build a case that survives legal scrutiny. And they must tell the family. That final step can be among the hardest. Imagine waiting nearly 20 years, then receiving a phone call. The case has been solved. We know who did it. Your daughter is dead. There is no simple way to deliver that information. No perfect words. No sentence that can make it less painful. But there can be dignity in knowing. That is what the investigation fought to provide. Dignity. Identity. Truth. Ridgway's imprisonment closed one door, but the broader investigation left others open. Missing women remained missing. Some cases remained unresolved. Some evidence remained under examination. And the question of additional victims remained. This is where the story becomes more than a serial killer narrative. It becomes a story about the limits of justice. Justice can punish a killer. It cannot restore life. It can identify a victim. It cannot erase 20 years of grief. It can solve a murder. It cannot answer every disappearance. The Green River case demonstrates those limits. And yet it also demonstrates what justice can accomplish. The killer was identified. He was arrested. He was prosecuted. He pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to life without parole. Families received answers. Victims were remembered. Evidence that had remained silent for years finally became decisive. That is not a perfect ending. But it is an ending that would have seemed impossible in the early 1980s. Back then, detectives were staring at a river and wondering how many bodies would emerge next. They did not know the killer's name. They did not know when he would stop. They did not know whether they would ever catch him. For years, the case remained shadow. Then science illuminated the face behind it. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. The man whose name will become permanently attached to one of the largest serial murder investigations in American history. But even after his conviction, the river did not become ordinary again. It could not. Too many memories had been placed there. Too many families had passed through the landscape searching for answers. Too many names were attached to water, and some names were still missing. That is why the Green River case remains haunting. Not because the killer escaped. He did not. Not because the evidence disappeared. It did not. But because solving the killer does not automatically solve every mystery. There are still families who want answers. There are still missing women. There are still questions about crimes that may never be conclusively connected. And somewhere in the surviving evidence may still be information capable of changing what we know. Part 9. The most frightening question in a cold case is not always who did it. Sometimes it is, how many more? In the Green River investigation, that question became unavoidable. Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 murders. That number is extraordinary. But the investigation did not automatically stop at 48. Authorities continued examining other cases, other missing women, other unidentified remains, other disappearances, because investigators knew that a serial killer may leave behind more victims than the legal system can immediately prove. The difference between suspicion and evidence remained crucial. Ridgway could confess to a crime, but investigators still had to verify information. A confession can be powerful. It can also be incomplete. Locations must be searched. Remains must be identified. Records must be checked. Evidence must support conclusions. The Green River case, therefore, became an enormous forensic puzzle. Every piece had to be examined. Every victim deserved the same standard. The investigation also confronted an uncomfortable reality. Some victims had been forgotten by society before they were forgotten by investigators. Their disappearances had not always generated the same urgency that might have followed the disappearance of a woman from a stable, highly visible family. This disparity became part of the case's legacy. The victims were often vulnerable. The killer exploited that vulnerability. And the investigation eventually demonstrated the cost of failing to protect people at the margins. Their names became known because they were murdered, but they should have been known because they lived. That is why the modern understanding of the Green River case places increasing emphasis on the victims. The killer's name is famous, but fame is not the same as importance. The women were important before Ridgway ever encountered them. Their lives mattered. Their families mattered. Their disappearances mattered. The investigation mattered because someone had to say that clearly. For detectives, the work required persistence across generations. One detective could begin the case. Another could continue it. Another could inherit the files. Another could use new technology. The case could survive personnel changes because the evidence remained. That continuity is one reason the Green River investigation became such an important example of long-term police work. It demonstrated that a case can evolve. The tools change. The questions change. The evidence can be interpreted differently. But the core objective remains the same. Find the truth. In 2001, DNA helped identify Ridgway. In 2003, his guilty plea provided additional information. After that, investigators continued trying to locate victims and clarify the scope of the crimes. The story therefore moved from identification to reconstruction. Who were the victims? Where were they taken? Where were they left? What evidence remained? What could be confirmed? What could not? Each question carried consequences. For families, an answer could mean the end of decades of waiting. For investigators, an answer could close one file. For the historical record, an answer could restore a name. But the opposite was also true. A failed search meant another unanswered question. A missing body meant another family, without a place to mourn. An unidentified woman meant another life reduced to uncertainty. That is why the Green River investigation still matters. It reminds us that justice is not measured only by arrests. Sometimes justice is identification. Sometimes it is recovery. Sometimes it is remembering. And sometimes justice means refusing to stop looking. The case also demonstrates the importance of evidence preservation. Imagine if biological evidence had been discarded. Imagine if old records had disappeared. Imagine if investigators had not preserved the material that later became useful. The 2001 breakthrough might never have happened. Instead, evidence survived. Technology improved. The sample was compared. The connection was made. And the case moved. That sequence has become almost legendary in forensic history. But it was not magic. It was persistence. A chain of decisions made over years. People preserved evidence because they believed it might matter. Investigators maintained records because they believed someone might someday find the answer. Scientists developed new techniques because they believed old evidence could still speak. And eventually, it did. The DNA did not merely identify Ridgway. It destroyed the illusion that time had erased the past. The killer had spent 19 years beyond the reach of definitive identification. Then the past caught him. Not with a dramatic chase. Not with a confession shouted in public. With science. A microscopic biological connection. That is what makes a story so powerful. The smallest evidence can sometimes carry the largest consequence. And in the Green River case, that consequence was enormous. The investigation changed the lives of investigators. It changed the families. It changed Washington. It changed the understanding of serial murder. And it changed the way cold cases could be viewed. A case that had survived for nearly 2 decades proved that an investigation does not necessarily die when the headlines disappear. Sometimes the headlines simply move on. The evidence stays. Part 10. There is no perfect ending to the Green River story. There is only the point where the known facts stop. We know Gary Ridgway was arrested in 2001 after DNA evidence connected him to the investigation. We know he pleaded guilty in 2003 to 48 aggravated first-degree murders. We know he received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. We know the investigation continued beyond his conviction. And we know that some women connected to the broader Green River investigation remain missing. Those facts create a strange contradiction. The killer is known. The killer is imprisoned. The killer confessed. And yet some mysteries remain. That is why the case continues to live in the public imagination. People want a clean ending, a beginning, a middle, a killer, an arrest, a conviction, the end. But real criminal investigations rarely follow that structure. They are messy, incomplete, full of uncertainty. A victim may be identified decades later. A body may never be recovered. A witness may remember only one detail. A suspect may confess to some crimes but deny others. A DNA sample may solve one question while creating 10 more. The Green River case contains all of these realities. The 19-year period between the first known body discoveries and Ridgway's arrest is especially significant. 19 years is almost a generation. Children who were born when the investigation began were adults by the time the killer was arrested. Detectives who started the case had retired. Technology had transformed. The world had changed. But the murders remained. That is the power of a cold case. It freezes one moment in history, while everything around it moves forward. A family can grow older. A parent can die. A sibling can marry. A child can have children. And still, one question remains. What happened to her? For some Green River families, that question lasted for years. For others, it lasted decades. The arrest of Ridgway answered many questions, but not all. That is why the case must be understood as an unfinished investigation in certain respects, even though Ridgway himself was convicted and remains imprisoned. The official record continues to identify missing women whose cases remain unresolved. Their names deserve attention. Their stories deserve investigation. Their families deserve answers. And that is where the Green River story becomes something larger than a tale about a serial killer. It becomes a warning about forgotten people, about vulnerable communities, about how easily disappearances can become statistics, about how difficult it can be to investigate crimes when victims have little social protection, and about the importance of preserving evidence even when the answer seems impossibly far away. The DNA breakthrough proved that a case can wait. The question is whether society is willing to wait with it. That requires resources, patience, records, technology, and investigators who believe that an old case still matters. The Green River investigation had all of those things. That is why it survived. The case also offers a disturbing psychological lesson. Ridgway was not caught because his behavior suddenly became theatrical. He was caught because technology finally created a link. That means the passage of time had given him a false sense of security. He could not see what investigators would eventually see. A trace. A comparison. A match. Science does not become intimidated by time. A biological sample does not care that 19 years have passed. It does not care that a suspect has built a routine. It does not care that memories have faded. The evidence remains what it is. And eventually, someone may know how to read it. That is the real legacy of the DNA breakthrough. It changed the meaning of old evidence. The evidence had always existed. The answer had not. There's a profound difference between those two things. For years, investigators had evidence but lacked the ability to interpret it conclusively. Then technology changed. The same evidence became powerful. The past did not change. The science did. And that was enough. Today, Ridgway's name remains permanently connected to the Green River murders. But the most important names are not his. They are the names of the women whose lives were cut short, the women whose families waited, the women whose cases forced investigators to continue, the women whose evidence ultimately helped expose their killer. The river remains. The roads remain. The landscape continues to change. But memory remains too. Every cold case is a promise that the passage of time will not automatically erase a victim, a promise that evidence will be preserved, a promise that new technology will be used, a promise that investigators will continue looking. The Green River case demonstrated the value of that promise. Because after 19 years, the killer was finally identified. But the story did not end there. It simply changed. The hunt for the killer became the search for the victims. The search for evidence became the search for identities. The pursuit of justice became the pursuit of closure. And the river, once a symbol of fear, became a permanent reminder of the women whose names must never disappear. Part 11. For nearly 2 decades, the Green River Killer was a question without an answer. Who was he? Where was he? How many victims were there? Would he ever be caught? Those questions followed Washington through the 1980s. Then the 1990s. The investigation grew older, but the questions did not. Then came 2001. DNA changed the story. Gary Ridgway was arrested. The man behind the name finally had a face. The killer who had remained unidentified for nearly 19 years was no longer a shadow. He was a person, a suspect, a defendant, and eventually a convicted murderer. In 2003, Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 murders. The number was almost impossible to comprehend. 48 women, 48 lives, 48 families forced to confront the same unbearable truth. And yet the number did not erase the individuality of the victims. Each woman had a name. Each had people who loved her. Each had a future that was stolen. That is why the Green River case should never be remembered only as the story of Gary Ridgway. It should be remembered as the story of the women who were lost, the detectives who searched, the families who waited, the evidence that survived, and the science that finally broke through 19 years of darkness. The case remains a powerful example of how justice can take time, sometimes far more time than anyone expects. In 1982, investigators could not have known that DNA technology would eventually identify their suspect. They could not have known that evidence collected decades earlier would become decisive. They could not have known that the man they were searching for would eventually sit across from investigators and provide information about his crimes. But they continued. That persistence changed history. The Green River investigation also reminds us that a solved case can still contain unsolved questions. Some women remain missing. Some cases remain uncharged. Some possible victims remain uncertain. The investigation may have identified the killer, but it did not automatically reveal every secret surrounding him. That is the uncomfortable truth. A conviction is not omniscience. A guilty plea does not explain every disappearance. A DNA match does not bring every victim home. Justice has boundaries. But those boundaries do not mean investigators should stop. The surviving cases still matter. The missing women still matter. Their families still matter. And the evidence still matters. That is why the Green River case continues to be studied. It is a story about forensic science. It is a story about serial murder. It is a story about investigative persistence. But above all, it is a story about time. 19 years. That is how long the mystery lasted before DNA helped expose Ridgway. 19 years during which families lived without answers. 19 years during which investigators kept files alive. 19 years during which a killer believed the past had disappeared. It had not. The past was waiting. Waiting inside evidence. Waiting inside photographs. Waiting inside records. Waiting inside memories. Waiting inside the biological traces left behind. And when technology finally caught up, the past reached into the present. The killer could not outrun it. That is perhaps the most haunting lesson of the Green River case. A criminal can escape investigators. He can escape headlines. He can escape suspicion. He can even escape justice for years. But he cannot necessarily escape evidence. Sometimes evidence waits longer than a human being expects. And sometimes the smallest trace can destroy an entire illusion. Gary Ridgway had spent years appearing ordinary. But DNA exposed a connection. The Green River killer was no longer a mystery. He was Gary Ridgway. The case had a name. The families had answers. The courtroom had a defendant. And the killer was sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. But somewhere beyond that conclusion, the river continues to move. Water does not stop for a murder investigation. It does not stop for a courtroom. It does not stop for a guilty plea. It keeps moving. And perhaps that is why the image remains so powerful. A river carrying away evidence. A river carrying memories. A river that became the place where investigators found the first signs of a nightmare. For decades, the Green River was associated with fear. Today, it is also associated with remembrance. The names of the victims remain. The case files remain. The evidence remains. And the unanswered questions remain. Because even when a killer is caught, not every mystery disappears. There are still families waiting to know where loved ones went. There are still women whose stories remain incomplete. There are still investigations that may benefit from future technology. And there is still responsibility to keep looking. The Green River Killer was caught after 19 years. That fact is remarkable. But the more important fact is what happened afterward. The search did not simply stop. Investigators continued working to identify victims. Families continued seeking answers. Authorities continued examining missing person cases. The story moved from catching one man to understanding the full human cost of his crimes. And that is where the true legacy lies. Not in the notoriety of the killer, not in the horror of the numbers, but in the refusal to let the victims disappear twice. First into the darkness of murder, then into the darkness of history. They had names. They had families. They had lives. And for decades, people searched for them. The DNA evidence finally exposed the man responsible. But the evidence did something more. It proved that old cases can speak, that science can reach backward, that time does not always protect a criminal, and that a cold case is never necessarily a dead case. Nearly 19 years after the Green River investigation began, the mystery finally had an answer. But even now, the river carries one final question. Not who was the Green River Killer. We know his name. Not whether he was caught. He was. The question is simpler. Are there still victims waiting to be found? And if the answer is yes, then the Green River story is not finished. Because somewhere in the remaining evidence, somewhere in an old photograph, a forgotten report, an unidentified case file, or missing person record, there may still be a name waiting to be restored. The river keeps moving. The years keep passing. But the evidence remains. And as long as someone is willing to look, the past is never completely silent. Part 12. But the Green River case did not truly end when Gary Ridgway walked into the courtroom and said, "Guilty." It only became clear how much of the darkness had been hiding beneath the surface. For nearly 2 decades, investigators have been trying to understand a pattern that seemed almost impossible to contain. Women disappeared, bodies surfaced, evidence accumulated, leads collapsed, years passed. Then DNA finally connected Ridgway to the investigation. But even after that breakthrough, one question refused to disappear. Who were all the victims? Because a serial killer can be identified before every victim is identified. A conviction can be secured before every missing woman is found. And a case can be considered solved while individual families are still waiting for the knock on the door. That is the unfinished side of the Green River story. King County's official investigation continues to acknowledge women whose cases remain unresolved. The sheriff's office states that 3 women listed in connection with the Green River investigation remain missing and that their cases remain uncharged. Among them is Cassian Lee, who was only 16 when she was last seen on August 28, 1982. Another is Kelly K. McGinnis, 18 years old when she disappeared on June 28, 1983. Think about those dates. 1982. 1983. More than 4 decades have now passed. For most people, those years are history. For a family waiting for a missing daughter, they are not history. They are yesterday. The last conversation. The last photograph. The last time someone saw her walk away. The last moment before life became a question. And that is what makes the Green River investigation different from the simple story told by headlines. The headline says the killer was caught. The family asks, "Where is she?" That question can survive a conviction. It can survive a sentence. It can survive the death of a detective. It can survive the disappearance of witnesses. It can survive generations. Because a missing person is not just an unresolved crime. A missing person is an absence, a chair that remains empty, a photograph that never changes, a birthday that arrives every year, a family member who still wonders whether somewhere, somehow, an answer exists. For investigators, those unanswered cases represent unfinished work. And the Green River investigation has repeatedly demonstrated why old evidence must never be dismissed simply because it is old. In January 2021, King County announced that one previously unidentified Green River victim had finally been given her name. She was Wendy Stevens. She had been only 14 when she ran away from her home in Denver in 1983. Her remains were discovered in SeaTac in 1984. For decades, she had been known through evidence rather than identity. A body, a case number, a set of remains, a mystery. Then modern DNA and genetic genealogy helped investigators identify her. After decades without a name, she was Wendy Stevens again. The sheriff's office described the identification as a result of detectives, forensic experts, and scientists using emerging DNA and genealogical technology. That moment carries a significance that cannot be measured by statistics. Because identification is not merely administrative. It is personal. A name changes everything. It tells investigators who to contact. It tells families where to look. It tells history who was lost. And it tells the victim that she was never just Jane Doe. She was someone. She belonged somewhere. Someone was waiting for her. Someone remembered her. And someone can finally say her name. But even as Wendy Stevens received her identity, another mystery remained. Other victims still had no names. In April 2021, King County announced that 2 of Ridgway's victims remained unidentified and released a composite profile created through advanced DNA analysis for a woman investigators referred to as Bone 17. Bone 17. Imagine being known only by that designation. No family name. No childhood photograph. No confirmed hometown. No birthday celebrated by people who knew you. Only bones. Only evidence. Only a case file. And somewhere inside that silence may be the story of an entire human life. This is where forensic science becomes more than a weapon against criminals. It becomes a tool for restoring identity. The same technology that helped investigators expose Ridgway can also be used to identify the women whose lives were swallowed by his crimes. DNA can point toward a killer, but it can also point toward a victim. And sometimes, identifying a victim is the final piece of justice. That is why the Green River investigation continued long after the courtroom cameras disappeared. The detectives were no longer simply asking where the killer was. They were asking where the women were. Who were they? Where did they come from? Who loved them? Who was waiting? What happened in the hours before they disappeared? And could their remains still be somewhere beneath the landscape? Those questions are painfully difficult because the landscape has changed. The Washington of 1982 no longer exists in the same form. Places have been developed. Roads have changed. Buildings have been demolished. Forests have grown. Property lines have moved. And yet old evidence can still point backward. A photograph can show a location that no longer looks the same. A witness can remember a road that has been rebuilt. A DNA profile can survive while an entire generation changes. That is a strange relationship between time and forensic evidence. Time can destroy memory, but it cannot always destroy DNA. It can erase buildings, but not necessarily the biological traces left behind. It can change landscapes, but records can preserve the history of those places. That is why cold case investigators continue returning to old files. They are not simply repeating the past. They are examining it with new tools. The Green River case is a textbook example. In 1982, investigators were looking at evidence through the technology available at the time. In 2001, they had more advanced forensic capabilities. Decades later, investigators have access to even more sophisticated DNA and genealogical techniques. The case changes as science changes. And that means a mystery that seemed impossible in one generation can become solvable in another. But there is another uncomfortable question. How much did Ridgway know? How much did he remember? And how much did he never reveal? In 2003, Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. As part of the agreement, he promised to provide complete and truthful information about the murders he had committed in King County. Investigators interviewed him extensively. They used his information to guide searches. Some of those searches recovered remains. Others did not. And that difference matters. A confession can open a door. It cannot guarantee what will be found on the other side. A location can change. A memory can be incomplete. A killer can misremember. A landscape can conceal evidence for decades. So investigators had to verify. They had to search. They had to compare. They had to document. The process was painstaking. There was no cinematic shortcut. No single dramatic revelation. Just investigators walking through old locations, examining evidence, and trying to reconstruct events that had happened decades earlier. That is the reality behind the headlines. Cold case work is often slow. It is repetitive. It is frustrating. It can produce nothing. And yet, one discovery can change everything. One DNA profile. One missing person report. One old photograph. One forgotten witness. One database match. One name. That is why investigators keep searching. Because they know the next piece could be the piece that matters. The Green River killer believed he had hidden his victims. But hiding a body is not the same as erasing a person. The evidence remained. The investigation remained. And eventually, the names began coming back. Wendy Stevens received hers. Others are still waiting. Somewhere, there may still be a photograph in a family album. Somewhere, there may still be a relative who wonders what happened. Somewhere, an old missing person report may contain a detail that investigators have not yet connected. And somewhere, perhaps, evidence still exists that can speak. That is the final tension inside the Green River case. Not whether Gary Ridgway was the killer. That question was answered. Not whether he would face justice. He did. The question now is whether every victim can be identified. Whether every family can receive an answer. Whether every remaining mystery can finally be pulled out of the darkness. Because the most powerful image in this entire investigation is not the face of the killer. It is a name written on a case file. A name that had been missing for decades. A name restored. And every time another victim is identified, the killer loses another piece of the anonymity he depended upon. He wanted his victims forgotten. Instead, investigators continue giving them names. He wanted time to erase the evidence. Instead, science keeps finding new ways to read it. He believed the river would hide what he had done. Instead, the river became the beginning of an investigation that would follow him for the rest of his life. The Green River still moves. The roads still carry traffic. People still live in the communities where the investigation began. But beneath the ordinary surface is a history that cannot simply be washed away. 48 murders were admitted in court. Additional cases have continued to draw investigative attention. Some victims have been identified only decades later. Some remain missing. And that means the final chapter has not truly been written. Not while a family is still waiting. Not while a victim remains unidentified. Not while an old case file still contains unanswered evidence. Because a cold case is not a dead story. It is a story waiting for someone to discover what everyone else missed. And after more than 40 years, the Green River investigation still carries that possibility. One more name. One more answer. One more family finally hearing the words they have waited decades to hear. We know what happened. And until every reasonable question has been answered, the river keeps moving. But the investigation keeps looking back. Because sometimes the past does not disappear. Sometimes it waits. Part 13. The most dangerous illusion in a cold case is a belief that everything important has already been discovered. The Green River investigation proved otherwise. For decades, detectives believed they were chasing a single nightmare through the forests, roads, and riverbanks of Washington state. But as forensic technology advanced, the case began to reveal something more complicated. Evidence could outlive memory. A victim could remain unidentified for decades. A missing person report could suddenly become relevant. And a fragment of biological material, preserved long before anyone understood its future value, could become the key to a mystery that had survived for generations. That possibility changed the way investigators looked at the Green River files. They were no longer simply reviewing history. They were searching history for information that modern science could finally understand. And that meant every old case could potentially become important again. Every unidentified woman. Every set of remains. Every missing person report. Every piece of preserved evidence. Nothing could be dismissed simply because it was old. The name Gary Ridgway had become synonymous with the Green River murders. But investigators knew that a name did not automatically explain everything. A serial killer's known crimes are only the crimes that can be established. There may be crimes never reported, victims never identified, bodies never recovered, disappearance records never connected. That is why the Green River case remained larger than Ridgway himself. It became a network of unanswered questions. And one of those questions concerned women whose identities had been lost. For investigators, unidentified remains create a unique kind of silence. There is no family to call, no confirmed hometown, no child photograph, no official name. The victim exists physically, but legally and historically, she can remain almost invisible. That is why forensic identification matters so much. A name restores a connection between the dead and the living. It gives investigators a starting point. It gives families an answer. And it gives the victim something the killer tried to take away. Identity. The case of Wendy Stevens demonstrated how long that process can take. She was 14 years old when she ran away from Denver in 1983. Her remains were discovered in Washington the following year. For decades, investigators knew that a young woman had died. They did not know who she was. That changed only after advanced DNA and genealogical techniques were applied decades later. Suddenly, the anonymous victim had a name. Wendy Stevens, 14 years old. A teenager whose disappearance had once been a mystery. The identification did not change what happened to her, but it changed how she would be remembered. Her family could finally connect a missing girl from 1983 to the remains discovered in Washington. A case that had been frozen for decades moved again. That is what modern forensic genealogy can do. It can build a bridge between an unknown victim and a living family tree. But it also raises a difficult question. What if the family tree is incomplete? What if relatives have moved? What if records are missing? What if the victim's family does not realize someone is missing? What if the victim came from another state? What if the person disappeared before modern databases existed? Every one of those problems can turn identification into a decades-long puzzle. The Green River case contains all of them. The investigation crossed time. It crossed geography. It crossed generations. And the deeper investigators went, the more obvious one truth became. The victims could not be treated as a single group. Each woman required her own investigation, her own timeline, her own evidence, her own identity, her own story. That work is painstaking, but it is essential because a serial killer's greatest advantage is anonymity. If the victim has no name, the killer controls the narrative. The woman becomes a body, a victim, an unidentified female. But when investigators discover her name, the balance shifts. She becomes a person again. The Green River killer may have tried to reduce his victims to objects he could discard. Modern investigators do the opposite. They restore humanity. And that is one of the most important legacies of the investigation. The killer's name became famous, but the investigation increasingly turned toward the names of the women. Some have been identified. Others remain unidentified. And some women may never be recovered. That possibility is devastating, because a missing body means a missing final chapter. Families may know something terrible happened, but they may never know exactly where. They may never have a grave. They may never have a place to visit. They may never have the physical certainty that a recovered body provides. That is why searches continue even decades later. A search can fail. The ground can reveal nothing. But investigators do not necessarily consider that failure permanent. Technology can change. Geographic information can improve. Old photographs can be digitized. Historical maps can be compared with modern satellite imagery. DNA methods can become more sensitive. And a new generation of investigators can notice something an earlier generation missed. That possibility keeps old cases alive. The Green River investigation became an example of this principle long before the modern explosion of forensic genealogy. The arrest of Ridgway demonstrated what DNA could accomplish. The later identification of victims demonstrated what the same scientific revolution could do for the dead. Science was no longer only about catching the offender. It was about restoring the victim. That distinction is profound. A criminal investigation usually begins with a crime, but a victim-centered investigation begins with a person. Who was she? Where did she come from? Who knew her? Who loved her? What did she want? What was she doing before she disappeared? Those questions may never be fully answered, but investigators can recover some of them. A name, an age, a hometown, a photograph, a family connection. Each discovery pushes the victim further out of anonymity, and each discovery makes the killer's legacy slightly less dominant. Gary Ridgway wanted control. Control over his victims. Control over the locations. Control over what investigators knew. But the investigation eventually took that control away. DNA identified him. His guilty pleas established dozens of crimes. Investigators used his statements to locate victims. And modern forensic science continued identifying women whose names had been lost. The killer could no longer control the story. The evidence could. That is the deeper meaning of the Green River case. Evidence is patient. It does not need headlines. It does not need public attention. It can remain inside a laboratory freezer, inside a police archive, inside a box, inside a database, for decades. Then one day, someone opens a file. A new analyst looks at the profile. A detective sees a connection. A genealogist finds a branch in a family tree. And suddenly, a case that had been silent begins speaking again. That possibility remains today. Even after Ridgway's conviction, even after the major headlines have faded, the investigation continues to cast a long shadow across Washington. Because there are still questions. There are still missing women. There are still unidentified remains. And there may still be evidence capable of answering them. The Green River Killer is therefore both a solved case and an unfinished investigation. The contradiction is not accidental. It is the reality. The killer is known. But not every victim is known. The criminal is imprisoned. But not every family has closure. The central mystery has been answered, but smaller mysteries remain. And those smaller mysteries are not insignificant. For the family of a missing woman, her case is not a footnote. It is everything. That is why the search continues. Not because the killer is still free. He is not. But because justice does not end with an arrest. Sometimes justice means finding the person who disappeared. Sometimes it means putting a name beside unidentified remains. Sometimes it means telling a family the truth after 40 years. And sometimes it means admitting that the truth has not yet been found. That honesty matters. Because the Green River investigation is surrounded by myth. The nickname, the numbers, the headlines, the horror. But beneath all of it are real people, real families, real evidence, real uncertainty, and real investigators who spent decades trying to separate fact from rumor. The facts are powerful enough without exaggeration. Gary Ridgway was convicted after pleading guilty to 48 murders. DNA helped identify him. Investigators continued searching for victims. Some previously unidentified victims have since been named. Other cases remain unresolved. Those facts alone tell an extraordinary story. A story about how science can reach backward through time. A story about how a case can survive generations. A story about how a victim can remain anonymous for decades and still eventually receive her name. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: a person does not stop mattering because decades have passed. A missing woman does not become less important because her photograph has faded. An unidentified victim does not become less human because investigators do not yet know her name. The passage of time does not reduce the value of truth. It only makes the search harder. And that is why the Green River case continues. Somewhere in the remaining evidence, there may be another answer, another name, another family, another woman whose story has been waiting for someone to finish the sentence. She disappeared. She was not forgotten. And one day, perhaps, investigators will finally be able to say what happened. Until then, the case remains open in the only way that truly matters. The search continues. The evidence remains. The names are remembered. And the silence is still being challenged. Part 14. The strangest thing about a cold case is that the past can suddenly become present again. A photograph taken 40 years ago can become evidence. A forgotten name can become a lead. A box stored in a police archive can become the center of an investigation. And a fragment of DNA collected when forensic science was still in its infancy can suddenly become the strongest voice in the room. That is the legacy of the Green River investigation. The case began in an era when detectives had to rely heavily on witnesses, physical evidence, and painstaking police work. There were no modern genealogy databases capable of connecting an unknown person to distant relatives. There was no instant national network capable of comparing every missing person case. There was no technology capable of turning every biological trace into a powerful investigative lead. There was only evidence, and investigators, and time. The killer understood time. For years, time appeared to be on his side. But time eventually became one of his greatest enemies. Because every year that passed also meant another year in which the evidence remained preserved. Another year in which investigators could improve their methods. Another year in which technology could become more powerful. And eventually, the past caught up with Gary Ridgway. The DNA connection in 2001 was not merely a forensic breakthrough. It was a collapse of an illusion. Ridgway had spent years existing in ordinary society. He worked. He lived. He interacted with people. He appeared to be another man moving through everyday life. But beneath that surface was a secret investigators had been trying to uncover since 1982. When the DNA evidence connected him to the case, the ordinary exterior became irrelevant. Science had found a connection. The investigation could move forward. But catching Ridgway did not answer the question of why. Why these women? Why this pattern? Why the repeated use of the same general areas? Why did the murders continue for so long? Those questions have fascinated investigators, criminologists, and the public for decades. But the most important questions are not necessarily psychological. They are factual. Where did each victim disappear? Where was she last seen? Who saw her? What evidence remained? What happened after she vanished? Where are the women who have never been recovered? These questions matter because a criminal confession does not automatically reconstruct every crime. Investigators still need evidence. They need locations. They need identification. They need corroboration. They need to know what can be established beyond reasonable doubt. And that is where the Green River investigation becomes extraordinarily complicated. Some victims were recovered. Some were identified. Some were connected to Ridgway through evidence. Others remain missing. The investigation, therefore, developed multiple layers. There was the legal record. There was the investigative record. There was the forensic record. And there were the family stories. Sometimes those layers matched perfectly. Sometimes they did not. A family might believe their missing daughter was a victim. Investigators might suspect the same. But suspicion cannot substitute for proof. That distinction is essential in any responsible true crime account. The Green River Killer's confirmed crimes are horrifying enough. There is no need to turn every unexplained disappearance into an accusation. That is precisely why investigators continue to examine cases individually. Each woman deserved her own evidence. Each family deserved a careful investigation. And each conclusion had to be supported. This approach also explains why unidentified victims remain such an important part of the story. An unidentified woman cannot simply be assigned to a suspect because circumstances seem similar. Investigators need evidence. They need DNA. They need anthropology. They need dental records. They need missing person information. They need family comparisons. They need genealogy. And sometimes they need all of those tools at once. The identification of Wendy Stevens demonstrated how far forensic technology had advanced. A young woman who had remained unidentified for decades could finally be connected to a name and a family. That was not simply a scientific achievement. It was an emotional one. For decades, the victim had been a question. Then she became Wendy, 14 years old, a daughter, a person. The moment a victim receives her identity, the case changes. Investigators can stop asking who she is. They can begin asking what happened to her. And families can stop wondering whether the unidentified remains might belong to their loved one. That is the power of identification. It does not solve everything, but it moves the investigation forward. There are still unidentified remains associated with the Green River investigation. One of the most haunting examples is the woman investigators have referred to as Bones 17. The designation itself is chilling. Not a name, not a family identity, a forensic label. It represents a person whose biological existence is known, but whose life story remains hidden. Investigators have used advanced forensic techniques to try to identify her. But until the name is confirmed, the mystery remains. Who was she? Where was she born? Who remembers her? Did someone report her missing? Is there a family somewhere that has spent decades wondering what happened? These are not abstract questions. They are human questions. And they explain why unidentified remains investigations can continue for generations. The technology may change. The investigators may change. But the responsibility remains. Find her. Name her. Tell her story. That mission also changes how we understand the Green River Killer. His greatest weapon was not simply violence. It was anonymity. His victims were often vulnerable. Their disappearances could become obscured by circumstance. He benefited from the fact that some people were less visible than others. But modern forensic science attacks anonymity directly. DNA creates identity. Genealogy creates relationships. Databases create connections. Old records become searchable. The anonymity that once protected a killer becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. That is why cold cases are experiencing a new era. A case can be 40 years old and still produce a breakthrough. A body can be unidentified for decades and suddenly receive a name. A missing person can be connected to remains found long before their family knew where to look. The Green River investigation belongs to this larger transformation. The case showed what happens when old evidence meets new technology. But there is another reason the case remains relevant. It demonstrates the importance of preserving evidence. If the biological material had been lost, contaminated, or discarded, the 2001 breakthrough might never have happened. The evidence had survived. That survival mattered. It created the possibility of justice. This is why investigators today treat evidence preservation as more than routine procedure. A piece of evidence may seem insignificant today, but technology tomorrow may reveal what it could not reveal today. A sample may appear too small. A trace may appear too degraded. A profile may appear incomplete. But future methods can sometimes recover information that earlier techniques could not. That is a lesson written into the Green River files. Never assume an old case has nothing left to say, because the evidence may be waiting for the right question. And sometimes the right question does not exist until decades later. Ridgway's arrest proved that. The later identification of victims reinforced it, and the remaining unidentified women make it urgent. The story therefore moves beyond the killer. The killer is known. The killer is imprisoned. The killer's crimes have been documented. The next responsibility belongs to the investigation itself. To find the missing. To identify the unknown. To preserve the evidence. To correct the record. And to remember the women as people rather than statistics. That may be the most important transformation of all. The Green River Killer once dominated the story. Today, the victims can reclaim it. Their names, their photographs, their families, their histories, their unfinished stories. Because the ultimate victory over a serial killer is not simply putting behind bars. It is preventing him from having the final word. Ridgway does not get to decide how his victims are remembered. The evidence does. The families do. The investigators do. History does. And every time another unidentified victim receives a name, the killer loses another piece of the narrative he once controlled. The river still flows, but it no longer carries only fear. It carries memory. And as long as the files remain open, the evidence preserved, and investigators willing to look again, the possibility of another breakthrough remains. Another name. Another answer. Another family finally releasing the question that has haunted them for decades. Where did she go? The Green River case has already shown that answers can survive 40 years of silence. The next answer may be waiting somewhere in the evidence. And if it is, someone will have to find it.